morning. My name is Patrick Seeb, Director of Economic Development and Placemaking with Destination Medical Center. We're so glad that you are joining us today on this, our fourth webinar to discuss what we call Forward, Creating Rochester's Future. And this is the development of the 5-year update to the DMC development plan. And for those of you who are not from Rochester, but are joining us regionally or nationally, Destination Medical Center is an initiative with the City of Rochester, Olmsted County, Mayo Clinic, and the state of Minnesota to really prepare Rochester for growth and its future. And every year, every 5 years, we update that development plan, and we're in the process and just finalizing that update now. And the update really is building off the work that was done in 2015 and much of the subsequent work that has occurred. But it's really intended to tailor economic development strategies to market conditions, to recognize the impact that DMC has had over the prior 5 years, to gather community input, and ultimately to meet the requirements of the state law. When DMC was established, the state legislature in its wisdom said it would launch with a development plan, and that development plan would need to be updated every 5 years. And today, this webinar, we are so happy to have two guests with us. Tom Fisher, who is former dean of the University of Minnesota College of Design, now director of the Minnesota Design Center, a well-regarded national expert, author of many books, and fortunately for us in Rochester, a member of the Destination Medical Center Economic Development Agency Board of Directors. So we're so pleased to have Tom Fisher, and you'll hear from him in just a moment. I'll also introduce Catherine Malmberg. Catherine Malmberg is an architect, an urban planner, and developer, a member of the University of Minnesota Design Center as well. And importantly, she has led on our behalf this 5-year update process. And so you'll be hearing from Catherine following Tom's presentation. So with that, Tom, there are more than 200 people registered for today's session, many of them from Rochester, but we know that there are people from around the region as well. And so we're going to ask you to tee up this conversation about this important question about what does Rochester's future look like, and having this conversation in the midst of a pandemic, I think, is both daunting and inspiring. And we're going to lean on you to talk a little bit conceptually and more nationally about what post-pandemic cities might look like, and then a conversation about what that means for Rochester. So with that, Tom, I'm going to give you the floor.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Let me share my screen here. I think one of the things that's interesting about pandemics is that while on one hand, they're very disruptive, on the other hand, they accelerate us into the future. And so buried in every pandemic is an opportunity to advance things that had been marginal prior to the pandemic, which then become dominant. And the history of pandemics show this to happen. So that, for example, excuse me here, I'm going to have to figure out how to advance my slide. There we go. For example, in the 19th century with the cholera epidemics, it really led cities to, for example, to put in place sanitary sewers and demand indoor plumbing, which of course led to the rapid rise of industrial cities and really enabled the kinds of cities that we have today. So this was triggered by a set of plagues. And the same thing happened in the 1918 so-called Spanish flu, the influenza epidemic, which led people to want to socially distance. And so, for example, even though the automobile had been developed prior to 1918 and people lived in single-family housing prior to that time, after the flu epidemic, there was a rapid expansion in the desire of people to live in single-family housing and to own private automobiles as a form of social distancing. And so the suburbanization that occurred in cities in the 20th century were in many ways accelerated because of the influenza epidemic of 1918. And so the question I think now for us is, how will this pandemic affect our cities? And what opportunities might emerge from this crisis? And I think there are at least a couple things, overall ideas that I think we have to think about. I think one of the things that this pandemic is doing is forcing us to rebalance the digital and physical worlds. Obviously, a lot of the things that we're doing now, telecommuting, telehealth, distance learning, online shopping, all of those things existed prior to this pandemic, but they were still relatively marginal in our economy. And what they have become now are dominant modes with which we are working, living, shopping, learning. And so we're seeing a rebalancing between what we can do remotely and digitally and what we need to do physically. And I think this is going to lead to a very different way in which we will occupy our cities and think about our daily lives. And then following that sort of rebalance is also this idea of what do we do remotely as these services and delivery of goods becomes much more common, and what do we need to do in person? And I think that that's going to force us to sort of reimagine physical space in terms of the experience that we get there, the immersive qualities of it that you can't get online. And so I think we will see a sort of sorting out, for example, in the retail sector between goods that can be delivered more conveniently to us at our homes versus experiences we want to have in physical space. I think another aspect of this is going to give everyone more choice where we live and where we work, which I think also is a tremendous opportunity for Rochester. So just some data to think about here. For example, 42% of the US workforce is now working from home full time, which accounts for 2/3 of the US economy is now coming out of people's homes, which is a remarkable transformation in what existed from what existed before. I think also interesting is that surveys have shown that 75% of those who are currently working from home want to continue to do so at least for some part of the week after the pandemic ends. And 32% of that workforce wants to continue to work full-time from home even after the pandemic. And so what we're seeing is a profound transformation in how people are thinking about work and their relationship to employment. I think what's also interesting is out of one of those surveys found that 91% of the employers also think that their staff are more productive working out of the home. And so this isn't simply being driven by workers, it's also being driven by employers. And so as a result of that, we're going to see a lot of the image on the right. We're going to see a fair amount of empty office space, which is also, depending how you see it, a tremendous opportunity to reimagine what a workspace is and why people would go to work. I think another point I want to make.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second because at some point I want to come back to this question of the 32% of workforce that want to work full-time from home, and I want to unpack that a bit, but we can save that for later, but I'm going to tee that up. But I also wanted to tell the audience, and I failed to do this at the outset, that there's an opportunity for you to ask questions in the Q&A box, and we would encourage you to do so. So as you're listening to this presentation or the conversation, feel free to populate the Q&A box with any questions that you have, and we'll try to get to those. So thank you. Sorry about that, Tom.
No, not a problem, Patrick. That's fine. And then I just want to point out the final bullet point. So about 30% of jobs cannot be done at home and require face-to-face interactions. And I think what's really important as we come out of this pandemic is to not have a kind of two-class economy where there are remote workers and then there are delivery people or so-called essential workers. And how do we make sure that our essential workers are not only well protected, but also well paid, and that we don't end up with this kind of division in our workforce. This is also, the pandemic is obviously having a huge impact on retail and street life. As you can see from some of this data, we have in the US 10 times the number of stores per capita than countries like Germany and France, 5 times the number of UK. In other words, we are way overbuilt in our retail square footage and in the number of retail outlets that we have. And that we're seeing a winnowing of that already. As you can see, the number of businesses that have already closed, 23% increase just since mid-July. and the percentage of those that are not planning to reopen. And so we're going to already see a dramatic drop in the number of local businesses. And so I think one of the things we need to talk about today is how do we sort of turn that around? What can we do to support local business? And what are the opportunities buried in this pandemic? I think there will be whole industries like grocery shopping that is going to just have a fundamentally different relationship with their customers than what they've had in the past, and simply by the amount of groceries, for example, that are being delivered on demand. We're also seeing a housing crisis. The number of people who have lost income, renters who are facing evictions. There are currently about 500,000 Americans in any given night who are either homeless or unstably housed. And there's some concern that, particularly with the moratoriums on evictions starting to lift, that we could have as many as 2 million people homeless this winter. And so we have a crisis in our housing area. We also have the number of overdue mortgages going way up. So we may also have a crisis in our banking industry. And yet we have this paradox, as this image on the right shows, that on one hand, we have people who lack housing, and then we also have a lot of empty space sitting around. And so I think one of the other issues that the pandemic raises is to force us to sort of reframe opportunities, to not think that necessarily because a building used to be an office building that's sitting half empty, that it couldn't also serve a housing function, or that retail couldn't also serve a function that would related to sheltering people, for example. And so I think that part of this is to sort of question the old ways in which we thought of our cities and how we defined uses in our cities, and to be more flexible and creative and adaptive in how we solve problems. Seeing a huge impact on transportation. Transit use has, in most cities, has virtually collapsed. Very little ridership. And we're also, of course, seeing the whole travel industry being affected, the airline industry, hotels, conventions, what have you, dramatically down in terms of usage. Meanwhile, delivery jobs are booming. It's the fastest growing job in America right now, as a delivery person. And other modes of transportation are also rising. For example, bike sales are way up, electric bikes, for example. And so we're starting to see people use a wider range of vehicles, many of them allowing for social distancing, which again is something that we saw in after the 1918 pandemic as well. And the idea that rush hour has largely vanished, and may have vanished permanently, because if we have more flexible ways in which people are going to the office sometime, working at home sometime, the idea of everybody going to the office at, say, 9 o'clock in the morning and leaving at 5 is probably never going to emerge again. And so we have sized our whole transportation system and our parking requirements, for example, around a mode of working that may no longer be relevant. And so thinking about these as opportunities to repurpose space, to reuse things in new ways, I think is also something that the pandemic presents to us. And let's see here, let me go to the next slide. For some reason, it's not letting me do that. So, okay, let me escape. I love it when these things happen. Let me go back. I'm going to stop.
While you're doing that,
there we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. And there are a few questions that have shown up. And again,
Okay.
I just encourage people to use the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. And then also just looking at how parks are being reused in new ways. There's been a dramatic increase in the use of open space. And I think we've probably already all seen new kinds of uses occurring in parks. So, worship services, outdoor classrooms that might have traditionally met indoors are now using outdoor space. And I think there's also an interesting environmental aspect to the pandemic. For example, some research that Stanford University did charted that sort of determined that there were 20 times the number of lives saved by reduced pollution in the Chinese cities that they studied than the number of people whose lives were lost by COVID-19. In other words, the reduction in air pollution has a much greater impact on health than COVID-19 has had. So I think that that raises questions in terms of how do we capture these environmental benefits? How do we use this to create a new normal in which, for example, there's less automobile pollution, less industrial pollution, and see that as part of a emergent interest in improving public health, which I think always comes out after pandemics. Public health reemerges as a priority for populations. Parks, as you can see, are now the most popular non-residential destination for people. Again, thinking about these assets that we have in our cities in new ways and what new functions they can play, I think is also important. So what are some of the challenges we face? And I think we've all become aware as a result of this pandemic that we do have enormous inequities in our society. It has revealed inequities in income and certainly inequities in working conditions. And so I think that one of the challenges the pandemic presents for us is how do we address those inequities? How do we make sure that, as I said earlier, that our essential workers are well protected, that they have all the PPE that they need in order to do their jobs, and that they are adequately compensated, that they are now, people who are delivering goods to our door are now just more visible to us. They're not some anonymous person in a back room. They are people whose work is essential for us, the rest of us, to do our work. And they need to be well compensated for that and valued for the role that they play in our economy. The second bullet point, the challenge is, what are we going to do with all of the empty physical space that we are going to see, not only now, but even after the pandemic, with a dramatic amount of office space that is underutilized, a drop in demand for retail space, perhaps a changing demand for hotel rooms, convention centers, a lot of the things that were premised on the idea that to do our work, we have to do it all face to face. I mean, for example, I think we will see conventions change, where a lot of the distribution of information that used to happen as we sat in a dark room and somebody was giving a lecture showing slides. Well, we've discovered that that's actually easier to do online and remotely. You have a much bigger audience, a much bigger impact, and it's a lot cheaper to deliver that kind of knowledge remotely. And so conventions may be more about people coming together to have conversations and less about sitting in dark rooms listening to a speaker. And so how might convention centers reimagine that role? And how might they change? How might they, in fact, allow for more space for comfortable conversation and have less space, for example, for presentation? And so reimagining the spaces that we have and not being held to kind of 20th century modes of working and operating, I think, is a challenge that we're all going to have. Pandemics are kind of paradigm shifting events in human history. And we have to be open to seeking out new kind of paradigms for almost every aspect of our economy. And then the final bullet point, I think there's no question that we've realized that high bandwidth access to the internet is maybe the crucial infrastructure of our time. We're seeing challenges not only in lower income communities who may not have that kind of access, but we're also seeing that in rural communities where the bandwidth simply isn't there. And so this, I think, is one of the big equity challenges that we have, is to ensure that everybody in our country can participate in this new economy, which is going to be much more digitally dependent than it was before. But with challenges come opportunities. And these are some of the things that I hope we can talk about this morning vis-a-vis Rochester, because I think there are an enormous number of opportunities for Rochester in this pandemic and coming out of it. For example, the idea that expanding digital access and embracing entrepreneurial ideas is really how we are going to fuel this new economy that we are already moving into, and ensuring that there's equal access and opportunities for everybody. And so this is an opportunity for us to not only face up to the inequities that we've had in our economy and in our society, but also to address them and overcome them, and to create a more equitable future. I think there is also these opportunities of the access capacity, not just the physical space, but also human capacity that is underutilized in our communities, and to think about how we leverage all of that talent and all of that insight and create places where people can create startups, incubate new ideas, start new kinds of businesses. I think is also recognizing the unique assets of every place. And here is where I think Rochester has a particular opportunity as it envisions itself as America's city for health. And how can one be a national or even international magnet for people who are interested in participating in the assets of that place? And then finally, this idea that I think we will all increasingly live locally and be connected globally. That part of what this pandemic has shown us is that our future is more about moving bits rather than bodies. And so this idea of thinking globally, acting locally, which comes from the 20th century, may in fact be one of the characteristics of the new normal. Mm-hmm. And with that, why don't I stop and turn it back to Patrick.
Thank you, Tom. There's a lot of great questions coming in, and we'll welcome more along the way. In addition, before I introduce and invite Catherine to take over for a moment, just know that this webinar is being recorded. It'll be posted on our website, dmc.mn. So for those of you who want to look more closely at any of the content. So Catherine, I'm going to turn to you, and as we begin to pivot this conversation to more of the local context, I would like to have you talk about the work that we did with HRNA, the consultant team that we asked to help look at and help us understand the impact that COVID would have on the economy of the Rochester community.
Certainly. Thank you, Patrick. So yeah, we did this 5-year update in a very different context than maybe was first envisioned when we started talking about the update in 2019. And a huge piece of that was looking at what the potential economic impacts could be of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we worked with economic advisory firm HRNA, and they have presented their work in a webinar that is also available on the DMC website if you didn't have a chance to tune in for that one. So I recommend that. But big picture here, what they did is they see that there's a pattern that emerges whenever these large transformative events happen. There's a huge shock, a decline in economic activity. Then there's a rate of recovery, and that curve can look very different depending on a multitude of factors. And then there's the emergence of some sort of new normal, which is a little bit what we're talking about here today. And so when they applied this analysis and built a model for Rochester, they were looking at all of
Catherine, would you just go back to this slide? So one thing that's important to, I think, for our audience to understand is this model relates to a pandemic. It could relate to a natural disaster like a hurricane or a flood, or it could relate to a more slow-moving economic shock like the loss of an industry. But really this model is about really understanding how deep the trough is and how to accelerate or potentially bend the curve towards a new normal. So go ahead.
Right. What can DMC or other agencies do to bend that curve? And what is that new normal going to look like at the end? Because that's not a fixed, necessarily a fixed point that we're headed towards. And that's a lot of what Tom is talking about. What is that new normal? And so they measured the sort of total change in economic activity and then helped frame up for us what the implications could be for different types of spaces that we have in the downtown district. So the next slide. This is, and again, this is just a high level summary, more detail in their presentation, but this is 3 potential curves depending upon essentially the time frame of when that return to consumer confidence happens, which is probably tied to some sort of vaccine or therapeutic milestone that really creates that change in consumer confidence. How far out does that occur from where we are today? And you might see these three different curves of recovery between now and the end of 2022. And so you can see the summary of the results there. And then the next slide, sort of translating that, right? And Tom's already mentioned a number of these things. There's probably going to be excess capacity in downtown office space. The retail and restaurants that are dependent upon employees and visitors downtown are going to feel a disproportionate effect. Hotels are still in a very depressed occupancy rate level, and we have a strong pipeline in Rochester of hotels, so the market will probably continue to see occupancy rates below historic averages. But housing demand remains relatively strong, and if we have growth in downtown residential, that will help support some of the core downtown retail businesses. Next slide. But at the same time, Rochester, came into this in a position of strength, right? There was great positive momentum. There have been significant losses, but Rochester, relative to both the overall state numbers here in Minnesota and some other comparable cities, has been faring better. And the healthcare industry and Mayo Clinic provide some of that stability during weak economies. And importantly, the city has the tools through this DMC initiative to support growth. So if we have the tools, what do we do with them? And HRNA kind of came out of their analysis with this set of recommendations for economic development strategies. And I think this could be a good place to start the conversation and tie this into what Tom was talking about. These are pretty broad recommendations. How might we drill in and get a little more specific about how this could be implemented in Rochester? And before we start there, I did want to say there were a couple of questions in the chat that we might address right off the bat. I think there's some interest in understanding what % of people were working from home before the pandemic, so that we kind of understand that it wasn't zero, right? So how big is this shift that we're talking about? And that will help maybe frame some of these conversations as well. So with that, I welcome Tom back to the conversation and would love to get your perspective.
Tom, you're on mute and we've lost you on the screen, so.
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay.
I was responding to some questions. So.
Oh, great. Thank you. So yeah, we were just saying, first, maybe if we could set a baseline of roughly how many people were working from home prior to the pandemic, just to understand how big that shift has been. And then maybe start talking about some of these broader recommendations for the city and where we might see Rochester kind of drilling into some of those pieces. Maybe let's start with the working from home trend and what those impacts might mean for the downtown core.
Well, sure. I mean, I was just answering a couple of those questions. There's been somebody asked, where did this data come from? There's been an interesting group at Stanford University doing a lot of this research, and I can bring some of my footnotes for some of these data and give it to the DMC if you want to put it on the website, for example. But, what's interesting is there were a lot of people who were working from home, like checking their emails at night, doing work on weekends. But the shift has been from people who basically did things in the evenings and weekends as part of their job, but were essentially still commuting to their office during the week, to now working full-time at home. And that shift has been enormous. And so in many ways, there were just, it was a tiny percentage. I think it was under 5% who were working at home full-time. And now it's 42%, right? So it's a dramatic swing from doing some work in the evenings, at home, which was relatively sizable number, to essentially that is your office. And we haven't seen that. And so this is part of this acceleration of something that existed prior to the pandemic, but it was still a marginal activity to now becoming a dominant activity for many people. And as some of the data is showing, people want to continue to do it. Many people are saying that for some of the challenges of working at home, they find that they have more time. They're actually, their lives are saner. and don't want to go back to a commuting routine. In terms of,
one thing,
yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
no, why don't you finish that thought, Tom?
Well, I mean, I think that in terms of Rochester, I think that, you know, and we're really for almost any major city, there are opportunities here in terms of new business models to serve people who are working at home, new kinds of activities that people are going to want to have closer to their home if they're not commuting into an office. And so I think that there are new businesses that will emerge out of this.
One of the comments, recommendations that come from HRNA, and it which has to do with public infrastructure, and part of what HRNA said to us, and I think we know this to be true, that cities that invest in public infrastructure during a downturn tend to come out of the downturn more quickly than cities who don't. But I think a legitimate question is, what kind of public infrastructure ought that be? And how do we, because this kind of public infrastructure, and DMC is really charged with investing in infrastructure, and infrastructure tends, you know, and is intended to have a 50+ year lifespan. So what does that mean to us in terms of transportation needs, in terms of, you know, what is the right infrastructure in this changing environment?
That's a great question. And I think that it's the opportunity in Rochester is to reimagine infrastructure in terms of health. Now, as we saw from the 19th and 20th centuries, a lot of the infrastructure that comes after a pandemic is health related: indoor plumbing, sanitary sewers, you know, what have you, social distancing technologies. And I think that as we think about infrastructure coming out of this pandemic, it is not going to be about how do we maximize the movement of people, because actually we're going to be moving bits more than we are people. The real opportunity is how can infrastructure improve people's health, improve environmental health, and create places for people to interact in different kinds of ways, as well as have multiple modes of transportation, some of which might be healthier for us, like riding bikes or walking. And so I think that, again, it's an opportunity to think about what is 21st century health-oriented infrastructure.
One of our observations in Rochester is the kind of innovation that we're seeing happen by businesses, and small businesses by their very nature are innovative. I mean, they're founded by people who are trying something, starting something new. Perhaps they develop a pattern and a success model that has been suddenly disrupted, and we are seeing businesses that are pivoting, that are embracing new approaches, that are recognizing that their prior successful model won't necessarily serve them, at least short term and maybe long term. What advice do you have to a small business that's trying to predict what next year should look like, and what their business should look like?
Well, I think many businesses are going to end up with a hybrid model where, as many of them are doing now, a lot of it is going to be in terms of, delivery to people's homes of goods and services. But the thing about physical space is we have to reimagine what can't be done online. What are the experiences that have to be done in person? Why would somebody want to come to this space? It's probably not going to be to just secure goods. That's going to be done more effectively remotely. And so we're going to have to reimagine the experiences that people have in physical space and think about what are people missing by being so remote. So I see that as an enormous creative opportunity for retailers and businesses generally.
Just sort of following on that, there have been some questions about how this might impact residential design, and also how design of spaces that help combat that isolation that we might be feeling when we don't have the sort of ritual of coming into the office on a regular basis together. I don't know if you have some ideas about both of those kind of potential trends in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and there are other things that are going on sort of simultaneously. I mean, we're doing research in our center related to the rise of autonomous vehicles and the move of the car companies to become mobility service companies. And one of the things we'll probably see within a decade or two is that most of us won't be driving cars. We will be calling up vehicles that will take us where we want to go. So there's going to be a lot of empty garages in people's houses. Now, we may fill it with stuff, as many people do, but nevertheless, there's also a lot of opportunities to, for example, fit out your office to be also a workspace or a production space. So we're going to start to see things happening in the home that are happening now, but at a much greater percentage. So people who will have a home office that's really fit out with the technology and the ergonomic furniture that you would need in an office, not just sitting at your dining room table, you know, at your laptop, or garages that become, you know, mini production centers or other, you know, childcare centers for, and so we're going to start to see, and as we already are, a lot of different kinds of activities going on in the home. I think this is going to require us to reimagine zoning. I think single family zoning no longer makes any sense when half of the businesses in America are now in people's homes. And so we're going to have to think about much more flexibility in terms of how people use residential space, but it's already happening and the economy is going to demand it. So it's not as if this is a blip and we're going to all go back to the way it was. This is going to be a permanent change in the function of the home. In many ways, you know, prior to the Industrial Revolution, most of the economy came out of people's homes. We basically were a homestead and farmstead economy until the Industrial Revolution. Now I think we are coming at the back end of that as we are automating many of the things that machines do better than us. And we are left back with the things that humans are really good at. And paradoxically, we're having a high-tech version of a pre-industrial economy where a lot of the economy is now, again, happening in people's homes. So it's going to require a reimagining of that and a reimagining of residential neighborhoods so that, for example, people go stir crazy if you're just at home all the time. But, you know, we may sort of have a reimagined corner store where it isn't just a corner store, it may be the corner tech hub, the corner co-working space, you know, the something that you can walk to interact with your neighbors or colleagues that you may not be able to afford to have at home, but you don't necessarily want to commute into an office to have it.
That leads me to the question that I said I'd be asking later, which is to sort of unpack this question of those that 30-some% of people who want to continue to work from home. And I think, you know, as we think about equity and, you know, as a sort of probably one of the most important issues of the 21st century, it seems like if you unpack that number, there are certain people in certain cohorts where working from home is really attractive and works really well. And then for others, it doesn't, perhaps because of their living arrangements or the number of people in their households. So talk a little bit about that and talk about how, you know, how does this become an equitable solution?
Yeah, I mean, great question, Patrick. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the data is that there's a generational divide. Baby boomers are much more inclined to want to continue to work from home than younger people who feel, I think that if they're not in some sort of social situation, they can't network as effectively. And so younger people want to, interestingly enough, go back to the office more than an older portion of the workforce. So there's a generational divide. And you're right. I mean, there is an issue where many people are in living situations where it's chaotic. There's, you know, you can't really work. There's not enough space or there's too many other things going on. And so I think that we're going to see a sort of in-between zone. I mean, I did a project this summer with a group of students looking at what's the office of the future. And they did a lot of research, talked to a lot of people and came up with an idea that a typical office floor might have some private offices, might have some co-working space, might have a childcare center, might have a shared conference room and access to technology all on one floor. And so this idea that instead of dropping your kids off at the daycare center, then driving to your office, that in fact, all of that might get intertwined in the building itself. And so we're going to start to see, you know, kind of dramatic mixes of uses that we have traditionally segregated the different parts of the city all happening together so that people can construct a life for themselves that works.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think maybe along those lines, there's a lot of discussion about, well, if people can work remotely, then where do they choose to live? And I think there's, different ways you can look at that question. It could lead one to, be concerned about an exodus from a certain place, or it's also an opportunity. How do we make sure that Rochester, right next to the Mayo Clinic, is where talent nationally wants to live now that they can work from anywhere?
Well, I would say internationally. To me, this is why Rochester is at such a crucial point and has so many advantages, because if you can literally work anywhere, why not work next to the world's best hospital? And so rather than being worried about people leaving, it seems to me the opportunity for Rochester is, how do we use this as an opportunity to be this enormous magnet for people who realize they can really be anywhere? And Rochester has so many advantages as, wanting to be this brand of America's City for Health. And it's so far along in that. Because I think that cities and even smaller communities are all going to have to build on what their assets are and think about what's their competitive advantage and why would somebody want to live there or work there. Many cities do have nowhere near the assets of Rochester as basically an international, magnet. And so to me, I think the opportunity here is, who in the world wants to be by the world's best hospital in a city that is really imagined around health? And I think we will find a lot of people interested in that.
Yeah, I think, and I think just picking up on that, Tom, the whole idea that in addition to being next to the #1 hospital and healthcare system in the world, we're also the gateway to the driftless region. We're also accessible to this, incredible food to table, farm to table food opportunity. We're also, 75 minutes away from all of the events and activities you might want in a big city. Now, I'm speaking as a transplant to here and evangelist in terms of what a city like Rochester, what Rochester specifically has to offer, that when people are choosing to move from the coast, and Catherine, you're one of them, choosing to move from an environment that's less appealing, why wouldn't we want to position ourselves and compete with the Bozemans and the Boulders and the Madisons of the world as well? Right.
Absolutely. I mean, all those quality of life issues become central to economic development in the post-pandemic world.
One of the conversations happening locally is about how we and DMC and others intervene to help businesses right now during this crisis. So in particular, I'm thinking customer-facing small businesses right now who are at really at a crisis moment for their own businesses, and that if they can make it, and now it feels like there's a horizon that's maybe 3 or 4 months when I think people are sensing that there's maybe reason to be optimistic that if we can just hold on for the next few months, that there will be the beginning return. What are some ways that communities can be supportive of small businesses during this phase that help get to the other side?
Yeah, I think that let's take restaurants, which are really struggling, right? Some of this may be going back to thinking about earlier paradigms. So for example, when the idea of the restaurant was invented in France just before the French Revolution, you didn't go to a restaurant just to eat food. You went there to have certain curated conversations with people. Restaurants were these places where you got restored, which is the origin of the name. And food was just part of it, right? It's a little bit like Starbucks. You go to get coffee, but you actually go to Starbucks to also work, right? And so I think that we may see restaurants needing to sort of reimagine that experience so that it's more than simply consuming food, which you can maybe do more readily by having it delivered to you. You go to the restaurant to get restored in some way, where there could be curated experiences in the same way that restaurants have music, for example, or spoken word performances or other kinds of things. So in other words, it's about how do you enrich the experience that really requires that people want to come there. And And that's just one example of how I think there are actually some things we used to do in the past that we might want to rediscover in the 21st century in new ways and reimagine why people want to be customers in the first place.
Well, I think you've used the term experience a few times during this conversation, and it does make me think about that. And I said this at the outset of this conversation, that it can be both daunting and exhilarating to think about what a downtown Rochester looks like when you have to work harder to get people to choose to come to downtown, to a downtown, or to downtown Rochester in particular. You actually have to reinvent because the old ways in which you could count on customers is changing. And what I'm hearing you talk about is as people can, many services and goods are commoditized. It really becomes, what are the experiences, unique experiences that can be created in a downtown that wins out over the option of just staying home.
Right, and how do those reinforce the brand of the place, right? And so America's City for Health, how might all of those experiences be around health and well-being, right? And could Rochester be this kind of incubator for businesses that have a kind of health theme driving them? And in many ways, I could also see Rochester being a place where businesses from anywhere in the world that want to be part of that experience would also want to come. And so and be a part of it. And so I think that, again, this idea of thinking about what's the international asset here, which Rochester already has, and then how do you build on that brand and make everything reinforcing the brand of the place?
And we've had some great follow-up questions on this in the chat as well, and I'll try and summarize them here. There's this question of the balance, right, between advancing and expansion and still maintaining affordability in a place like Rochester, and how do we kind of make that happen? And also what the impact might be on transportation if people have this different relationship. Maybe they're mostly working from home, but they still sometimes need to come into the home-based office, right? And that changes that pattern. And do we have transportation, that supports that, basically? Or mobility, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so much of our transportation system has been built on this 20th century model of 9 to 5 work, commuting, rush hour, and a lot of our public transit is based on that, where, for example, frequency declines in evenings, or other weekends, for example, when in fact people may have a much more flexible schedule where they're going into the office on a weekend because they've been home all week. But I also think that we're going to see much more of an on-demand transportation system, not only in terms of mobility services, but also what transit is. I think the idea of running, mostly empty buses around a city is just a total waste of resource, right? And so why wouldn't we develop public on-demand transit? And what might that look like that's much more adaptable to people's schedules, which are much less predictable than they were in the past.
And another asset that Rochester has that a couple of people have asked questions about too is the river that runs through downtown, right? As something that brings people to it. And I think we're at this moment where there's kind of a chance to reimagine and re-envision the relationship to the river and the downtown. So it seems like a big asset to also be thinking about.
Yeah, that gets to the quality of life issue that you raised, Patrick, right? I mean, for better or worse, the river through Rochester has been treated as a problem that the Army Corps of Engineers have tended to deal with in terms of flooding rather than as this enormous asset. That, and I know DMC is working toward this goal of helping people have access to the water and make it a great experience rather than a problem to be controlled. So again, these are the changes in mindset that I think cities need to think about. What are all of our assets and how do we maximize them toward our brand and toward attracting people who may be coming from other cities around the world that have great riverfronts? Well, Rochester needs to have a great riverfront too.
So another question has come in around, you talked a little bit about manufacturing and some of the changes we might see in it, right? People changing their garages to fabrication centers or things like that. Other thoughts about the differences that we might see from the 20th century trajectory and into the 21st and that relationship to technology?
Well, we're seeing this kind of micro production capacity now emerging with 3D printing and CNC fabrication and, you know, AI and artificial intelligence and virtual reality. I mean, there's all sorts of technologies that have existed prior to the pandemic, but have been still somewhat rarefied and not part of people's sort of daily experiences. But I think that, you know, for example, the idea that instead of buying things, you might download a file and you might actually make it in your garage is something that is now possible in a way that wasn't possible before. And already, even before the pandemic, over half the small businesses in America were coming out of people's homes. And so there's already a lot of production going on, and all you have to do is go onto the Etsy website to see the amount of stuff that people make. It's just that we haven't recognized it. We still call these residential districts without sort of realizing the amount that's already happening. And I think that will only increase as large-scale mass production is increasingly turned over to robotics and sort of large-scale production. We're going to see a return to craft, to making of, you know, things at a much more local scale to meet particular needs. And so I think that, again, this is an opportunity for people to sort of reimagine what they're doing. I mean, you know, the sharing economy, for example, helped us realize that every asset that's sitting around underutilized is a waste of a revenue stream, right? So Airbnb realized there were a lot of empty beds that could be turned into revenue for people, or, you know, Uber and Lyft, empty seats in cars that could be turned into revenue. And so we're going to see an economy going forward where people are both consumers and producers. And every asset has an opportunity to also be a source of revenue for a family, for an individual. And so this is part of how the sharing economy is a kind of paradigm shift and how we think about everything that we have. And we may see a move toward people owning less and sharing more and paying for only what you use when you need it, rather than having all of this assets sitting around underutilized all the time.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's, oh, go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the recommendations that HRNA offered up, and not surprisingly so, on the screen that Catherine showed earlier, is this need to quickly start being creative about thinking about reuse of excess real estate, excess office space, excess hotel. And part of what their advice was is you won't feel it today or next week perhaps, but there will be excess capacity as leases expire and businesses make more permanent changes in terms of how they occupy a downtown. What are three things that Rochester ought to be considering with respect to, I'll just say, excess commercial office space?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to see much more co-working spaces, much more the need for incubator spaces. So how could, empty offices become thematized? Some of these co-working spaces that have really succeeded have been not so much just providing space for people, but curating relationships. And so there's actually a curatorial role where, somebody thinks, well, here's one business that needs to meet somebody else who's starting another kind of business that we think is related. And so the value proposition is, how do you curate startups and new ideas? So that's one notion. Another notion would be to imagine a floor of an office building becoming housing. Now, it may be difficult to transform some of that because of all of the plumbing needs of an apartment unit, for example. But so how might there be new forms of housing? Co-working, so the co-housing equivalent of co-working, where you might find people, and we're seeing this particularly in an older generation, where there's a desire for people to live in more collaborative ways with others, to work against loneliness and isolation. And so how might we reimagine an office floor as a new kind of co-housing facility of some sort? Unless
that seemed too extreme. I mean, all of the reuse of Lower Town in St. Paul, which was 19th and 20th century warehouses that have been converted. So this is not this is not the first go around of
Absolutely, right. Those started as warehouses and production facilities. Now they're places for people to live. And we may see the other happening as well, which is some floors of office buildings might just be tech hubs that have equipment that people can't have at home, but need access to on occasion, and send files for things to be made or produced. And so, I just think that, again, we have to be much more flexible and allow the economy and the marketplace to drive what happens, rather than think, well, this is an office building, it can only be an office building. These terms actually get in the way for us to creatively reimagine this space.
So I interrupted you. I asked you for 3, and I heard 2 so far, which is the incubator makerspace, and then a new kind of housing. A new kind of housing. So I'm not going to let you off the hook. What's the third? What's the third?
Well, I think that what my students came up with, which is imagining an office floor that had childcare in it, that had a classroom in it, that had, in other words, the entire family might be on the office floor with you. And so what's interesting to me about that is that the office ends up looking more like the home. Just as the home is becoming more like the office will have many more of the features of the home and of the residential neighborhood. And you'll go to the office to have conversations, so it'll feel more residential in spirit. And so I think we're going to start to see these kind of hybrid combinations of things so that people can actually have a life.
Well, there's a great question in the chat that might be a good one to wrap things up here. There are a lot of different trends we've talked about today. Which one are you the most pessimistic about that might lead us in a direction we're not looking to go? And what are you the most optimistic about? So something to watch out for maybe, and something you're really excited about.
Wow. Well, I am worried about the inequities that we will end up with a 2-class economy that I mentioned earlier, where we'll have, a permanent sort of delivery workforce that is underpaid and exploited. It's like the gig economy. I mean, there's the potential for the gig economy to be really great, but there's also a potential for it to be really exploitative, where people don't have health insurance, they're working 5 jobs. We can't let that happen. I mean, that work is too essential for all of us to let that happen. So that's what I'm most pessimistic about, is we won't recognize the value of all work by everybody who's working, and that we need to make sure that everybody can have a decent life and a decent income. What I'm most optimistic about is that pandemics force us into paradigm shifts. A lot of things that we thought would never happen have happened literally in a matter of weeks. I mean, I had colleagues at the University of Minnesota that said, oh, we'll never go to remote learning. And like in a matter of a week, we were all in remote learning. And it turned out that we could do it, right? And so this ability to recognize that things that we thought would take a long time can actually change overnight, right? And so inequality, institutionalized, racism, I mean, all of these things that we thought were unsolvable and can change. And to me, that has been one of the great realizations, I think, is that we can move when we have to, and pandemics force us to. This is no longer a choice. We're all either going to move into the future because we've been accelerated into the future, or we're going to be left behind and be forced to go anyway. And so being open to that change and being excited about it and seeing all the opportunities buried in it, to me is what I'm excited about.
I think that is a great way to end this conversation, and let me do so by thanking all of you who joined today, and the robust set of questions that we tried to address. Of course, we didn't get to all of them. As I said earlier, this presentation will be posted on dmc.mn. I want to thank the team at DMC who are behind the scenes, have been running this program and managing this. So first of all, I should be sure to thank them, as I thank Catherine and Tom for their comments, their insights, their wisdom. And we so appreciate having both of you as a part of the DMC team. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.